Good afternoon once again to our listeners on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, our viewers on the Parliament channel, and those of you joining us on the World Wide Web via the Parliament's website www.ttparliament.org. We are just a few seconds away from 5 p.m. and the resumption of today's sitting of the Senate. We expect matters on the adjournment to be taken before the House adjourns. Let's take you over to the chamber.
The Honorable, the President.
Now resume our coverage of the 15th sitting of the Senate in the first session of the 11th Parliament that takes place on Tuesday, April 26th, 2016.
Madam President, okay. Madam President, I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn to Thursday, the 28th of April, 2016 at 1:30 p.m. And during that time, we will be dealing with the government business motions, the motion on the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Act, Chapter 4850, and the provisions of Section 7 of the Custom Act, Chapter 7801.
Honourable Senators, before I put the question on the adjournment, leave has been granted for a matter to be raised on the motion for the adjournment of the Senate. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much. Madam President, I rise to bring to the attention of this Honourable Senate what appears to be, from the literature emerging, a possible concern as to crisis in food supplies in Trinidad and Tobago as a result of the deepening foreign exchange situation. Madam President, the inaccessibility of foreign exchange and the continued depletion of the nation's foreign exchange reserves are contributing to the creation of what can be described as a black market or a parallel market for the currency, for the U.S. currency in particular, driving up in the process food prices in Trinidad and Tobago. As you know, Madam President, the base prices of imported items at our supermarkets and groceries are linked to the access to US dollars. Suppliers are not getting or securing the required amount of US currency to purchase goods that they traditionally import to supply to the people through the groceries and supermarkets and other outlets. Now, we know, Madam President, that the price that is called for on the black market is not what you pay for when you go to the ordinary commercial banks. We know that the price has been fluctuating from $6.36 in September of last year to over $6.60 per US dollar. At the unit trust, it is about $6.85 per US dollar. But on the black market, we understand it could be as high as $7.50 or even beyond.
$7.80 at the airport.
And when you have to access monies at that price, Madam President, the cost of goods, the cost of food will also increase in the process. Now, we understand, Madam President, that there are supermarket owners who were in the media speaking and predicting that within the coming period, if there is not sufficient supply of foreign exchange for them to pay their creditors abroad, there could be an emerging food crisis in the country. I do not know if they are exaggerating. I do not know if they are dramatizing the situation. But it is our responsibility to bring it to the attention of the President of the Senate and to this Honorable House, and to hear from the government whether this is just histrionics, whether it is just theater on the part of the Supermarket Association, or whether there is a real difficulty, Madam President, that this could emerge and occur. And therefore, what steps are being taken by the government to give priority or put food import that we cannot produce locally, Madam President, as a priority item in terms of foreign exchange allocation. So this is a matter, Madam President, that we would like to hear the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries on. We wouldn't like a situation to emerge in our country, whether it's the next 6 months or the next year, where we do have a situation of crisis because of the worsening foreign exchange supplies. I recall, Madam President, in October of last year, some $500 million US would have been pumped into the system to ease what was called the backlog in foreign exchange supplies based on the high demands that were in trade at that time. And Madam President, even with the supply of $500 million US into the market, we still are today experiencing foreign exchange difficulties. In fact, Madam President, between September of last year to the present period, our foreign exchange reserves was reduced by close to $1.3 billion US, because it started off at about 10.3 or 10.4 billion US, Madam President. I think today it is about 9.3 billion US. So there has been a depletion of our foreign exchange reserves in the country. So we know that there is need, Madam President, for us to ramp up food production in Trinidad and Tobago in whatever categories. And I think the Minister has been trying to explain to the nation that there are certain areas that we will never be able to satisfy in terms of food import. We will always have, in terms of local production, we will always have to import food into this country, because there are certain foodstuffs that we do not and we just cannot produce and manufacture in Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, we want to ensure, Madam President, that we do not have a scarcity of vital food supplies on our grocery shelves when members of the public, citizens of this country, have to access on a monthly basis or daily basis or weekly basis their supplies to deal with their daily needs or weekly needs or fortnightly needs, Madam President. So we have brought this matter to the Parliament to solicit and to extract from the government whether, for instance, there is an emerging food crisis in our country as a result of the worsening and deepening foreign exchange situation that we are faced with. and whether, in light of this possible reality emerging, what steps are being taken by the government through the central bank to ensure that there's a proper priority allocation given to the food importers to ensure that there is not a crisis in the coming period. And we would hope, Madam President, that the government, will take the necessary steps to ensure that this situation does not occur. And I am hoping, Madam President, what I've brought to the attention of this Honorable House, based on reports that we have been reading and seeing in the newspapers, is not true, and the Minister of Agriculture could clear the air on this matter once and for all. I thank you very much, Madam President.
Honorable Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam President, thank you very much for the opportunity to respond. Let me commend Senator Mark on the use of very responsible language in dealing with his motion. The motion, as I have read it, talks about an emergent food crisis in view of the deepening foreign exchange crisis. But in discussing the motion, he's talked about the possible concern as to a crisis in view of the deepening foreign issues with the foreign exchange supply. So, on the one hand, he's talked about in his motion an emergent food crisis. And the government is confident that at this time we do not face a food crisis in this country. And we are also confident that given the measures the Minister of Finance has outlined in this House on several occasions in dealing with the issue of foreign exchange management, that the management of the foreign exchange supply by this government would ensure that all the needs of the country would be met in terms of the requirements for foreign exchange. But in the context of food, the food supply and the food prices, let me just remind the Senate. The import dependency of this country on food is significant. And if it's any crisis that we're facing in this country, it's a crisis of over-reliance on imported food. The WTO has reported, based on 2015 figures, that this country is importing 85% of its food and agriculture supply. And that is a real crisis. The real crisis is over the years, because of the very supply of foreign exchange, we've allowed ourselves to become overly dependent. And it puts this country's food security at risk. But as I've said before, it also puts our nutrition security at risk. Importing food from sources that are questionable, of a quality that may be questionable. And that is a real crisis. The fact that we've moved to a point now where we are held hostage by the international market. And Senator Mark in his motion talks about prices in relation to this crisis. But it's not just the prices. There are a number of factors we have to take into consideration. Foreign exchange is one, dealing with the cost of imported food. There's also the shipping costs. And there's a discussion, while Senator Mark refers to a discussion 2 weeks ago amongst the supermarket owners 2 or 3 weeks ago on supply, there's a current discussion on the failure of importers in this country to lower their prices on account of reductions in the shipping costs. As Madam Speaker, if the cost of energy products have gone down, the price of oil has gone down, then there should be a saving that is passed on to the consumers. So shipping costs also influence, the fluctuation of that cost will influence prices. And that is why the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, the Ministry of Trade, the Consumer Affairs Division has been so vigilant, going around to supermarkets and alerting the country to the need to be very careful when making choices in terms of purchasing and where you purchase and from whom you purchase. So that's one factor. As Senator Mark has indicated, I've previously talked about the things that this country currently imports in relation to food and agriculture that we will have to continue to import. And I've set out the list. And at the top of the list, of course, is things like maize and wheat, beef. At the bottom of the top 10 is pastry, of course, which is something we could do without. There's no need to import that into this country. But the fact is that it's not just the foreign exchange, but the price of these commodities. For example, as wheat prices, international wheat prices and international maize price of oil for cooking purposes go up on the world market, our prices will go up without regard to the state of the foreign exchange availability. So there are a number of factors. And the point in response to this motion is that the government, and this ministry in particular, have taken the approach to food security and nation security that in the first instance requires an examination of what we import for consumption, that 85% that we import. And secondly, to identify those things that this country should not be importing, like cassava, sweet peppers, cabbage, lettuce, a proliferation of fresh fruit and vegetables that we produce here that should not be imported into the country. And that is the approach of the government, to identify those areas in which we can produce alternatives for local consumption and put this in the hands of the consumer. But there are other factors unrelated to foreign exchange when we talk about prices, and the government is concerned, in particular, the impact of rising food, imported and local food, on the vulnerable in the society. And that has to do with the middlemen and the proliferation of middlemen, especially in agriculture. The proliferation of middlemen that makes it expensive as food moves from the farm to the table, passing through several middle hands, and the rising costs. And what has the government done? Apart from encouraging food production, and I've also already talked about the link between dealing with the issue of land tenure, the vexing issue of land tenure, making it possible for farmers to make an investment in farming and making more supply available, bringing down food prices. But another issue is this issue of bringing food closer to the consumers, reducing the number of hands it must pass through, and making it more affordable. So in response to the motion, the government is confident, Madam President. The government is confident that this country is not in a food crisis. And again, as I've said, Senator Mark has been very careful to talk about the possibility, the potential, and there's always a potential if we remain as dependent on imports as we are. The government is also very confident that at this time we do not have an issue with the management of the foreign exchange. We understand there are issues because of our lowered revenue on energy. There are issues with the inflow of foreign exchange. The government is confident that its strategies in relation to managing foreign exchange will not lead us into the crisis that Senator Mark has also responsibly flagged as a potential. Thank you very much.
Honourable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Thursday, the 28th of April, 2016, at 1:30 p.m. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. This Senate now stands adjourned to Thursday, the 28th of April, 2016, at 1:30 p.m.
Next week, we go.